Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Christina podcast, where we connect the dots and search for more balanced mental health. Today, we are making invisible things visible for people who have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and the nuances of OCD when they go hand in hand with ADHD. In today's episode, I'm talking to Tia Wilson and Jenna Overbaugh from NoCD, a collective organization group founded in the US with global work dedicated to the treatment of OCD and all its various subtypes. Tia Wilson is an advocate for the awareness and treatment of both OCD and ADHD. She comes to us from Utah. She draws on her personal lived experience with both. She runs the community support group program at NoCD, including creating and facilitating their weekly ADHD and OCD groups. She's passionate about increasing awareness and training for therapists working with this overlap, and is currently working on an exposure-based coloring book for individuals with OCD as a means of making treatment more accessible to the more creative and neurodivergent brains. You guys know I love that. She is passionate about helping others live uncertain and find their values and practice living in the gray. Jenna Overbaugh is a licensed professional counselor and the clinical marketing director at NoCD in the state of Wisconsin. She has been working with individuals who have OCD, anxiety, and related conditions since 2008. Her work includes several years at the residential level of care, as well as intensive outpatient, partial hospitalization, and outpatient levels. She's contributed to research on hoarding, dropout from residential OCD recovery programs, and relief experiences in OCD. She's also the host of the podcast, All the Hard Things, which focuses on OCD, ERP, postpartum, and related concepts. She can also speak about OCD from the lived experience perspective as she dealt with postpartum OCD with her now 4-year-old son. Thank you so much, both of you, for coming and talking to our audience today.
Yeah, thank you.
That was a great intro, by the way.
I know. Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
You guys are impressive. It's really nice to be able to have your expertise, because OCD in particular is one part of the mental health world where there's a lot of mystery and misinformation, and things that I think seem like they overlap. And I think to the untrained eye, a lot of other clinicians might miss it. So I'm really happy to have both of your perspectives here. Jenna, can you kind of maybe get us started and orient us with kind of like the proper clinical definition of OCD?
Absolutely. So when we're looking at OCD, we really see it as a two-part problem. So first things first, we have obsessions, and within that are really these just intrusive, repetitive, we call them ego dystonic experiences, meaning we don't like to have them. They're inconsistent with our values. And these experiences can come in the form of thoughts. So what if I don't love my partner enough? They can come in the form of images. So wanting to just like swerve, or like imagining yourself swerving off the road when you're driving on the bridge, even though you don't want to. They can also come in the form of intrusive feelings or intrusive kind of commands. Sometimes we hear people experiencing ideas, intrusive thoughts, experiences, all those things. So the reality is that we all have intrusive thoughts. Research shows that every single person on this earth has and experiences intrusive thoughts, meaning just these weird thoughts that we don't really understand where they came from. It's just that when it comes to anxiety and OCD, these individuals, they tend to want to control the thoughts. They tend to want to draw some responsibility from the thought. They tend to feel like that thought and that experience is significant and says something. So that, in misinterpretation makes the person feel really anxious. They're kind of investing in it. And that leads us to the second part of OCD, which is, of course, the compulsions, which is also synonymous with rituals, or we call them more largely kind of safety behaviors. And that would be, it can be behavioral. So it could be an overt behavior like hand washing or reassurance seeking, repetitively asking a question of someone. But it could also be just a mental behavior as well. It could be thought stopping, like, oh my gosh, stop thinking about that. Don't think about that again. Don't think about that. There's a whole wide array of various behaviors that could fall under that. But so really basically we're saying that there are these obsessions, these intrusive and disturbing experiences that can come in a lot of forms, and then also these compulsions that people feel driven to do to negate or otherwise remove some type of anxiety that they feel as a result of that obsession.
Right. We could almost do a whole episode on each one of those different subtypes, which is not even all of them that you kind of referenced there, right?
Oh yeah, and we're shifting more and more in the field to even understanding, there are an innumerable amount of subtypes, right? So
Mhm,
even ones that are a little bit more non-conventional, but we're learning more about, like relationship OCD or sexual orientation OCD,
mhm.
those subtypes didn't necessarily quote unquote exist several years ago, but
Yeah.
they did exist. I mean, people were still having those thoughts. It's not like all
Mm,
of a sudden people are having those thoughts. It's just that we're talking about it more now and we're learning more about it. We're researching it. So,
yeah.
we're getting to the point where there's so many different subtypes. We're kind of understanding that OCD is not actually about any of these, subtypes that they present themselves as, that it's actually the dysfunctional relationship with doubt. So in other countries, they actually nickname it the doubt disorder. It's
Mm,
just at the end of the day, it's just a really unhealthy and dysfunctional relationship with doubt. And at the core of all of it is tending to be this intolerance of uncertainty, which is a concept that we talk about a lot in the recovery process.
Totally.
yeah, that's like that. A dysfunctional relationship with doubt is a really handy way to think about it. That really helps crystallize it in a very practical and I think in relatable way. And Tia, from your expertise in terms of ADHD and OCD, whether they're co-occurring or whether you have ADHD and you know it or don't, but the kinds of the relationship we have with doubt when we have got ADHD. Can you comment on that? Because to me, there's all
Yeah.
kinds of like bells going off in my head about that.
Totally. Well, I mean, we know that both ADHD and OCD come with a lot of black and white thinking. That's something that's a trademark of both. So some of that kind of all or nothing, kind of having a hard time being in the gray. And the gray is where the doubt is, right? That's where all the uncertainty lies. And so we kind of want to find some sort of certainty on either side of things. And especially when you grow up having ADHD in a society that's geared toward neurotypicals, I think you kind of have an externalized locus of control, right? And so you feel kind of that you don't have a lot of control over the things that you would like to. And so I think that that also lends itself to more black and white thinking as we're doubting a lot of things around us, trying to find a semblance of control in the midst of it. I think that there's a lot of discussion about kind of the reasons that we see some of the black and white thinking and perfectionism and ADHD. And
Mhm,
one of those trains of thought is it's because of the society that we live in, right? And the fact that
mhm.
it's not very accepting or understanding of ADHD minds.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's definitely a huge overlap between the two, and especially when it comes to that idea of doubt.
Yeah. I thank you for that. I think when you think about the trajectory of a late diagnosed person with ADHD, so you've lived your kind of whole life with this like unspoken sneaking suspicion that
Right.
you're not doing it right some of the time, right? Maybe not all the time, because sometimes maybe it's good, you're in your groove, but there's always like this sense of like a misstep. And so then it's easy to see, especially for the way, girls and women are socialized culturally, that we're constantly looking for some external cue that we're doing it right, that we're okay. And then school compounds that with the way we're graded and
Totally.
evaluated. And then we can become quite rigid about ensuring that we either don't forget or we show up or we're doing it right or we're not going to face that awful feeling of judgment or having made a mistake. And those behaviors on the outside can look a lot like OCD type behaviors, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
And
there's a
then,
lot of shoulds, right? Like you
yeah,
should do school this way, you should take breaks in this way, you should have a room that looks this way, right? There's so many
yeah.
things, and that's what OCD loves, right? OCD is all about those shoulds and the
Mhm.
ways we should be behaving, and how to kind of keep ourselves in line, which definitely, again, has a lot of overlap with some of that ADHD.
Yeah. And I think sometimes people think that like perfectionism, for example, and ADHD are really strange bedfellows. But they do show up a lot together. And I think it's perfectionism as a compensatory behavior, right?
Right.
Which is exhausting. But then there's also a perfectionism subtype of OCD too, right? Um,
Yeah.
can you guys talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's quite interesting and doesn't outside of the OCD world, I don't know if that gets enough public education.
Yeah. Yeah. Oftentimes when we think about perfectionism, a lot of people think, I guess in relation to OCD, a lot of people are thinking about perfectionistic about the way your office space looks, right? It's very much a physical form of perfectionism, but in reality, perfectionism can grab onto anything. It can be you're perfectionistic about the way you practice religion. You're perfectionistic about the way you show up in different spaces, the way you look. You're perfectionistic about your grades or your work performance, right? It can grab on to truly anything. And it again comes back to that idea of doubt, right? You're kind of doubting that you maybe have worth or that the things you're doing are worth doing unless they're done perfectly, right? And so you try to do a lot of compulsions to ensure that you are exhibiting perfectionism, but which as we know is not possible. And so you often are left in this state of feeling like you are a deficit, like that you haven't done enough and you haven't reached all of these shoulds. So it can lead to a lot of kind of chronic feelings of like a lack of self-worth or discomfort and anxiety, sorry. Yeah, Jenna, do you have any thoughts on the perfectionism?
Yeah, I mean, I do believe, and we know from research that people who have OCD and anxiety and related conditions, they tend to exhibit certain mental experiences. They tend to, obviously, with some exceptions, there are exceptions to every rule, but they tend to exhibit a lot of rigidity. So a lot of rigidity, like Tia was mentioning, like I have to pray this way, and this is how I have to practice my religion. Call that perfectionism, call that rigidity, call it an intolerance of uncertainty. We can start to see the overlap in this example of that kind of presentation. But people also tend to feel like this needs to control their thoughts. Like the only thing that can be in my head is all good stuff. It has to be good all the time and it has to be all perfect. And that's also very rigid. And it's also very intolerant of anything bad, right? So I think back to the earlier point about subtypes, right? I think the media and therapists too, for the longest time, I thought it was about the subtypes until someone told me that it's not actually about the content. It's actually just the doubt disorder coming up in these different ways.
Right.
If we kind of zoom out and we allow ourselves to get detached from, oh, it's the fear of germs, or, oh, it's the fear of, being sent to hell or whatever. If we zoom up and we kind of like make ourselves bigger than that and we get abstract with it, we realize like, there's these common themes of perfectionism and rigidity and intolerance of uncertainty and doubt and repetition that kind of weave its way, regardless of what the presentation of OCD is. It's those common waves that exist in all of those different subtypes, including and certainly the perfectionistic attitudes.
Wow.
Totally.
I know we're going to get to talking about what do we do about this, and if we do and when we do and what those clues are. But I just want to back up a little bit to the origins. So in terms of, can you guys share like what percentage of people with ADHD might have OCD and any of the information? And then in terms of the origins of OCD, is it something we're born with? Is it there's genetic links? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Totally. Yeah, I need to pull up the statistic because it's
Sure.
I'm blanking on it currently, but maybe Jenna, do you want to weigh in on the origins while I do that?
Absolutely. So I'll start off and talk about the origins quick while Tia kind of prepares to talk about the specific statistics with ADHD. But we know with OCD, as along the lines of with other mental health conditions, that it tends to be both a biological issue and also an environmental issue. So it's very much a nature and nurture type of situation, as it is with a lot of mental health conditions. So we know from twin studies, we know from the research that we've done that there is a biological and neurological component. So we know from brain scans that individuals who have OCD tend to have higher blood flow in certain areas of the brain that other people don't, who do not have OCD or obsessive compulsive tendencies. We know that it does tend to run more in families. And so with that said, not everybody gets it, right? So, if you have parents or close direct relatives who have OCD or related condition, it doesn't mean that you are bound to have it and that 100% you will exhibit those tendencies. What it does mean is that you are more vulnerable to it. And so I like to think of it as kind of a loaded gun. I like to think of OCD and a lot of mental health conditions as a loaded gun, and that biological predisposition makes you vulnerable to expressing some of these tendencies. But environmental factors will really dictate whether or not that gun gets triggered. And when it comes to environmental factors that can kind of influence the triggering of that gun, nothing causes OCD. There's no one cause. We don't know enough about it to say, but we definitely see at certain periods of time where there's a lot of stress, a lot of transitions occurring. So a big job transition, certainly we know that having a baby for hormonal reasons, but also because it's just a big stressful life event, that's also associated with an exacerbation in OCD symptoms. It could be due to, a lack of social support. So in modeling, I mean, it could really go on forever, but it's really more of a loaded gun type of theory for sure.
Yeah, and is there a standard age of onset that we see, like later years? It's not there, while there can be childhood OCD, that's rare. Is there a more standard age of onset, like late teens, early 20s, or no?
So we do see, I believe it's a little bit different for boys and for girls. And there are some differences for when boys get noticed of having it versus younger girls. I believe that, OCD can really happen anytime. So we know that OCD, it's actually part of the neurotypical development for toddlers to like arrange their favorite stuffed animals and to have sensory related issues like with tags or like uncomfortable socks. So we kind of like to see to make sure like to what extent is this really interfering with the family's life and the child's life. But usually like high school age, like young adulthood is typically when we start to see those really big exacerbations or kind of that gun firing off. And I think that has to do with a lot of different things. I think it has to do with, those are kind of when those big transitions are taking place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like going to school, having to get a job and, more adult life transitions. So yeah, it kind of coincides at that age range where all those big life events are really taking place.
And that part is like ADHD, in that while we're born with ADHD, we don't get it or develop it later. It can be revealed later, and often
Right.
around major life transitions and different fluctuations. So that's helpful to kind of draw those distinctions. Tia, did you have?
Yeah. So in terms of the overlap between OCD and ADHD, the current statistics, and I think they're really messy because they haven't gone into enough research on this overlap
I
yet.
would agree.
But it's around 21% of kids and 8.5% of adults with OCD who also have co-occurring ADHD. And so, again, there's a number of things that could account for that gap. We talked a little bit about late stage diagnosis being common with adults with ADHD, and I think we'll probably see an increase in some of those numbers in terms of adults who also have ADHD, if I were to guess. But it is definitely one that we see a lot of people experiencing both, and it seems kind of counterintuitive. A lot of people online are like, no, those are opposite disorders. I've heard them described that way because it's like ADHD means you don't have impulse control. This is again the stereotypical idea of it all. No impulse control, whereas OCD has too much, right? But in reality, they often do go hand in hand and play off each other's symptoms in a really, really interesting and unique way.
Yeah. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not certainly an expert in OCD, but, there being like a major, too much serotonin versus not enough dopamine in ADHD. Like there's also neurotransmitter differences,
Right.
which affects, like, if there's medicine to be used, the medicines
Yeah.
for each.
Yeah, it definitely can cause a difficulty in finding medication if someone has both co-occurring ADHD and OCD. Because a lot of the time with our OCD, we're doing things like serotonin reuptake inhibitors, right, that are supposed to help with the the OCD.
Serotonin. Yeah.
Right, but then it often
Serotonin.
makes
Yeah.
ADHD like a little bit worse, or sometimes
Right.
we'll see the opposite when someone is, a lot of ADHD meds are stimulants, right, which often exacerbate existing anxiety issues.
Yeah.
And so people will try to use like a dopamine or a epinephrine form of medication for their ADHD. That's the only one that doesn't cause overlap with the with the OCD. Now I'm getting all the acronyms confused.
Yeah.
But so a lot of people with both will end up turning more toward the dopamine and epinephrine forms of medication. But it's a very tricky thing to figure out, and a lot of people
Balance. Yeah.
experience a huge difficulty. And it also leads to a lot of people getting diagnosed for the first time. So they'll try a medication for their ADHD, recognize there's some OCD that's there because of the exacerbated symptoms and be able to get treatment, or vice versa. That's something that I see really commonly in our ADHD and OCD support group. That's seems to be when a lot of people go and first get diagnosed, is when they have the exacerbation of symptoms from medication.
Yeah. So something that Jenna said a second ago, I want to just highlight on when she talked about the extent of the symptoms. And so for everyone who's listening now, who's like, oh my gosh, I think I have OCD, you might not, right? But if you do, it's good to see an expert and get that sorted out. But it is the question of, of all of the, quirky things that we do as humans to cope and get along in the world, at what point do those things start to derail your life or make
Right.
it not as functional on a daily basis as you would like to be, right? And
Great
that's kind of like my litmus test. And I don't know if there's a different general one that you guys recommend.
So as therapists, we look for a couple of different things. The three big ones that you'll see in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the DSM, are going to be: one, the level of distress that the OCD or the related, the symptoms are causing to that person or to the family, right? Because especially when we're talking about kids and adolescents, maybe they're not super distressed by their symptoms, but their family is, right? Because they're having to accommodate or drive them to school after hours or whatever. So we look for distress. How distressed are you by these symptoms? Then we look for the level of impairment of your activities of daily living, or ADLs. So that would be, to what extent are these symptoms interfering with your ability to do the basic activities of your life? So, showering, eating, going to work, going to school. But I also think it can also be things just like your values. So like if you like to play basketball, but your OCD is telling you that you need to do this a certain number of times, and that's so overwhelming, or, going to practice, you tend to have these blasphemous thoughts about your coach, and now you don't want to go to basketball anymore, even though you really love it. That's an example of impairment. And then something that I'm not super on board with, but we can use and we'll keep it, can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but in the DSM, it does technically say that these experiences should take up at least an hour a day. Now that includes mental compulsions, which are very hard for somebody to quantify.
Right.
Very difficult for a therapist to obviously see and witness, especially the first time that we're going over a diagnostic kind of experience. But so those are the things. But largely kind of outside of that, like very narrow and specified criteria, what I tend to encourage people to think of is, people with OCD, they do not like it. They're not cool with it. They're not like, yeah, it kind of works for me sometimes, right? Like the individuals who I've worked with, and I've been doing this since 2008, they hate it. They hate it. They do not want to do it anymore. They find it exhausting. They would rather they would do anything to get out of this cycle and to be able to kind of make sense of what's going on in their head. But it's very difficult to get out of. And the treatment is, honestly, as you'll hear later, is very paradoxical. So it doesn't make sense right off the bat. But yeah, I mean, I if anyone's out there kind of thinking about it, if you're having thoughts or experiences that you do not want to have, and you feel like you're making decisions in fear over your values, it's worth talking to somebody about.
Right.
Totally. Yeah, and it's important to recognize that everyone has some level of obsessions and compulsions. So the most common one I feel like is, I'm scared of relationships, or I'm scared of being left alone, right? That's a common obsession. And so I'm not going to date, or I'm going to date in a very unhealthy way, right? Everyone does.
Yeah.
What?
Can we talk about that? The relationship anxiety?
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, those are ones that we see in everyone. Everyone has something that they are concerned about, and so they do something to get rid of their distress around it, right? That's what a lot of coping behaviors develop from, is people wanting to get away from their distress. And it's similar to ADHD in that it's like people can have symptoms of executive dysfunction without having ADHD, right? You can have obsessions and compulsions without having OCD, but like Jenna said, when it reaches that level that's causing a detriment to you and your values and the things that you would like to be doing, that's when it's worth talking to someone about. But we can
Right.
totally talk about the relationship OCD. I think that's a really, really big piece. One of the most common things I hear in support groups is, I don't just run the ADHD and OCD one. I run around 15 every week. And one of the most common things I hear when talking to different people is the reason they're getting treatment is because of their loved ones. Like they want to be able to have relationships with these people. That's almost always the top value that's driving
Right.
people to seek help, right? But like Jenna said, it's a doubting disorder. And so when you're doubting those very people or doubting your ability to be in relationship to those people, it
Yeah.
causes a huge impairment and a lot of like just hurt within you, right? It can look any type of way. It can look like someone not trusting their partner despite trusting them, having a lot of intrusive thoughts about whether they should, right? Is this person maybe going off and doing something crazy behind my back, and kind of feeling the urge to go and do compulsions to make sure that they are not. It might look like feeling that you are not worthy of being in a relationship. So you do compulsions where you are not seeking them out, or you're running away really quickly because you don't feel like you're worthy of being in them. And I think one thing to keep in mind as we talk about these is these are symptoms, but they can be symptoms of things like trauma as well, right? There's a
Right.
lot of reasons someone might exhibit these behaviors in a relationship, so it's not always OCD. But really it's any type of doubt about your relationship and then doing something to get rid of the uncomfortable feelings that doubt brings on.
So, how do you guys tease apart the nuances of what this is? So say it's that example. Say we've got somebody with relationship OCD, potentially in a relationship with somebody with ADHD. So there's some like inattentiveness. So there's stuff driving, like real stuff that could be driving, like say attachment issues.
Right.
There's an attachment overlay I can see here, which is really interesting. And then like despite like there's no amount of reassurance that can be given, and the person is still constantly doubtful on the relationship OCD side. How do you tease apart what the approach is, or do you need to, if the trauma therapists out there will be going like, it's just trauma, you just got to treat the trauma, and because
Right.
there's also a piece with OCD that a lot of traditional therapy can actually make it worse, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I can see that playing out really easily if someone is not aware of the way to address OCD originating.
So it's a common problem. So people generally come into treatment thinking that their relationship is the problem, or
Mhm.
I just need to figure out a way to be more sure about my relationship and then I'll be fine. Or
Yes.
very similarly with sexual orientation OCD, like I just need to figure out what sexual orientation I am and then I'll be fine. And they realize very quickly that's not our goal in therapy and exposure and response prevention, that we can never be 100% sure. And
Mhm.
that our goal in treatment is to get them to be able to tolerate the natural uncertainty that is in that. And
Yeah.
uncertainty doesn't mean 50-50. Like I'm 50% sure that I'm straight and I'm 50% sure that I'm not. And like, it doesn't mean 50-50. It just means that we're able to go on and move and live our life without having to nail down every single little detail and be 100% sure about it.
Mhm.
And so in the event of relationship OCD, which happens all the time, people often, like I said, they want to come and figure out their relationship and figure out whether this is a signal versus is this just noise? Do I need to respond to this as a problem? In that situation with people, I say, okay, fine. Even if it was an issue with the relationship, how are we functionally problem solving that? We can
Mhm.
both agree that continuing to ask the same question again and again and again and again and again I want to call it OCD. You might want to call it an actual problem in the relationship. Can we both agree that that's not functional, that that's not functional problem solving?
Feel better. Yeah.
Yeah, so we come to this agreement that, the OCD is just, it's just avoidance of, it's avoidance. It's a way to stay safe. It's a way to feel like you're solving a problem, but you actually don't solve the problem. And if anything, you make more problems for yourself. And so those are all actually very common problems that happen in treatment, but they're all very treatable. Where we always say, and I'm sure Tia will laugh at this too, OCD is sneaky. An ERP and OCD therapist is way sneakier. So we are we're very aware of all of of the sneaky tricks. We're very aware of all the typical trajectories and all the patterns and all of the justifications that people have for their doubts. But we can always raise that because we believe so strongly in the treatment, and we can get them to a place of recovery. It's really great.
Okay, so tell us about exposure and response prevention treatment.
So I would love also, as a therapist, I have my own little explanation of it. I would love to hear Tia's firsthand experience and representation of what it is, having gone through it herself. But so exposure and response prevention is our two-part solution to that two-part problem. So we have the exposures, but we also have the response prevention. So exposures are these ways that we encourage in a challenging but manageable fashion for individuals to face their fear. So, whatever their triggers are, whatever their values are, whatever their obsessions are about, we design in a very collaborative fashion things that are challenging but manageable for them to do to face their fears. Now, at the same time, that exposure, there's no point of it if everything is just the same. There's no point of it to watch that romance movie, but then go ask your partner 500 times if they love you, right? Like that is exactly what they were doing, right? So we need to do the exposure, and we need to do the response or the ritual prevention, which is I'm going to watch that romantic movie and I'm not going to ask my partner for reassurance. I'm going to touch that dirty thing and not wash my hands. I'm going to, as a female who is terrified of potentially being attracted to women, I'm going to look at swimsuit models and I'm going to not check my body for signs of physical arousal. So it's really a two-part solution to the two-part problem. And it's more effective for OCD, anxiety, and related conditions than any other treatment for any other disorder. So while it might seem paradoxical to some people, it works. There's more literature and more evidence to support it than any other behavioral or psychological intervention out there. And it's the gold standard. It's really, really amazing.
Totally.
Yeah, Tia, what do you have?
Yeah. So I think one of the beauties of ERP is that it's done in a hierarchy. So it's not just like, oh, you're scared of snakes. Okay, jump in this pit full of snakes, right? It's very much, we start really small. Maybe it's like, let's look at pictures of we'll watch a little TV show for kids about snakes, right? And then maybe we'll look at pictures of them online. And then maybe we'll sit with just the sound of snakes. And we're doing this 1 hour focusing on each thing, right? We're not just doing this all in this span of one day. And we're building up slowly. So each step feels like a step. It doesn't feel like this huge leap until the very end when you're able to go outside and garden. Maybe that's what was values consistent that you weren't doing because you were scared of snakes, right? But we're going to start with those very, very small little teeny baby steps, getting you closer and closer to your distress and letting your body naturally wind down from it without you having to intervene with any type of compulsion. So for me, I like to say that I've experienced all the different themes I've ever heard of are ones I dealt with to some extent at some point. My OCD was really debilitating to the point where I wasn't able to leave my apartment. It was classified as clinically severe, just really was not functional. Those ADLs that Jenna mentioned, those activities of daily living, had just gone out the door. And so I was able to kind of get started with just one of my themes. I started with my scrupulosity, which is kind of the threat of not doing things in a way that's moral. And so I had a lot of religious scrupulosity. So it grabbed a lot onto my religious experience and would give me all of these religious rules and take them to an extreme. I like to call it like it was a cult in my mind of just having to do everything exactly right. And so a lot of my exposures were about bending those rules and doing things a little bit wrong in my understanding. So it was things like, okay, I'm not going to read this book of religious text. I'm going to read it from another religion, and I'm going to sit with any distress that comes up with that, right? Or I'm going to practice praying in a way that doesn't feel, quote, right to me, right? A lot of those little teeny steps to get to a place where I had the ability to choose whether to engage with my religion instead of just doing it out of the place of fear and shame of going to hell or whatever. And so one of those exposure hierarchies that I did that I think is really pertinent to this discussion about ADHD and OCD is I had a huge fear of wasting time. And that came obviously as a result of being a kid with ADHD and having a lot of structure that I couldn't seem to motivate myself to keep, right? I didn't know how to study for a set amount of time and then take a break. I had a really hard time and a lot of guilt anytime I did take a break. That felt like it was not okay. And so I had a lot of fears around wasting time, to the point where I would kind of sit in my room having 2 invites to go to different places. You know, maybe one was a party, maybe one was a study group, and I would sit there panicking, unable to decide which one to go to the point where I just wouldn't do anything, right? And because I didn't want to choose one that was less worthy of my time. And I kind of grew up with this phrase, good, better, best, never let it rest until your good is better and your better is your best, right?
I feel like I have teachers that said that to me in elementary
Right.
school.
It was really conducive to that ADHD perfectionism. And then the OCD definitely grabbed onto it and was like, okay, is what I'm doing right now the best thing, or is it just good, right? Is reading this book the best thing, or should I be reading this book while I go for a walk? Like, I just really grabbed onto everything. And so I did a lot of exposures where I would intentionally waste time, which sounds so counterintuitive, but it would be something like, I'm going to sit in a room with self-help books next to me on this couch, and I'm not going to read them. And I'm going to sit with the distress knowing I could be improving myself, right? Or being, quote, productive, and I'm not. Instead, I'm wasting time here. Or I'm going to spend time with my family and I'm going to watch a TV show. I used to like bring a journal with me when I would watch TV because I felt like I couldn't just sit and relax. That felt wrong. So I would try to like journal at the same time and multitask. And so my exposure was not multitasking and sitting and watching a movie with my family. And it was amazing how distressing that was, not to have these other tasks going on. But eventually, you know, I'm able to get to a place now where I'm able to incorporate a lot of really healthy breaks that work with my ADHD mind. It's really, ERP is very different than the way we treat ADHD. With OCD, we're wanting to combat the way we're responding to it, right? We're wanting to change the way our brain is responding to this doubt and get good at sitting with the uncertainty. With our ADHD, we're wanting to work with it, not against it, right? We're wanting to find ways to serve our brain and work with the way that our brain is automatically kind of wired to work instead of trying to make those big changes. And so there's a huge contrast between the two. And I had to spend a lot of time understanding what that looked like, and kind of going from the ERP experience where I was used to just, okay, here's a feeling, I'm going to do the opposite of what it's telling me to do, to ADHD treatment, which I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD till after I went through ERP. Where I was like, I'm not trying to change this behavior. I'm trying to make my systems work in accordance with this behavior, right? If I'm needing a break every 30 minutes, how do I make that happen in a way that's not a detriment to my work environment, rather than how do I force myself to work for 2 hours straight, right?
It's amazing to hear you talk through all of that. You know, if you're somebody with ADHD listening, like, and you identify with this stuff, or you're kind of like, oh, you know, I run headlong into doubt and fear, so that probably necessarily might cross you off the list from this kind of category. But it's so easy to see how overlapping and how confounding and how these things can actually be mistaken for each other in a lot of ways if you're not kind of really getting into the qualitative experience that somebody's having. Like, if you hear, there's a difference between, you know, because I in our group we train graduate interns and stuff as well, and so it's one thing when someone comes and kind of tells you things that happened, but if you don't slow down and really try and feel for the qualitative experience of what actually was driving the thing?
Right. What's the
And
intention?
what were they trying to block? What were they trying to not experience by the experience they either intentionally or involuntarily chose? And slowing down all those processes can feel really tedious and painstaking. And apologies to any of my clients that are like, yeah, I know, Christina. But it was really important to be able to do that, right? Because
Totally.
to, you know, the one question I kind of have listening is that, so in that moment when you resist the urge to do the compensatory behavior and you're filled with the distress, are you allowed to do anything else to distract yourself, or you have to just sit there and feel it? Like, what's the general guidance? Or does it depend?
So I forget who said this. I know it's I believe it's either Jonathan Abramowitz or John Hirschfield. They're both amazing. But a really big pioneer in our field said or encouraged us to act with uncertainty. And so a lot of times you'll hear people in our field say, oh, you just have to sit with it or sit with uncertainty. And we get questions like that all the time. Like,
What does it actually mean sit, right?
I'm supposed to like actually sit with it. And oh my gosh, I get it literally all the time. And I say, no, you don't have to sit with it. I mean, you can, but you don't have to. Like, we don't put,
Right.
the whole message is that we're not putting our world on a halt because of the thoughts that we've had or because of the distress that we feel. And so I really like this act with uncertainty perspective instead of sitting with uncertainty, because it's much more assertive. It's much more like, I'm moving on with my life. I feel uncertain. I feel uncomfortable. I feel that nagging feeling that I want to give into a compulsion. I'm not doing it. And I'm going to continue to act a life within my values. I'm going to continue to act as though that thought or that experience doesn't warrant any attention, because it doesn't. So act with uncertainty. I really, really love that.
So the intention really matters.
Totally.
The intention matters a ton. And to add to that, I would say a really quick and kind of tongue-in-cheek thing that people can ask themselves is WTF? What's the function? So, you know, one thought or one compulsion might be way more related to like ADHD, or one thought and one behavior might be way more related to ADHD, but it can also be exactly like it would fall under the OCD umbrella. It totally depends on the function, right? So Tia, I don't know if you can come up with an example.
Yeah.
That
100%.
The same presentation superficially, but when we get down to it and ask ourselves, WTF, what's the function of that behavior? And if you ask those questions very clearly on this angle, it's OCD potentially. And on this other angle, it might potentially be something else.
Totally. Yeah. And this is probably one of the most common questions we get in the ADHD and OCD group is, I am doing X. Is this something I need to do exposures with or not? Right. So one of the best examples I can think of is I was going through the ERP process, and I'm someone who would always have earbuds in, like love listening to music, or even like The Office, a show that I know really, really well, on repeat while I get things done, while I'm doing my dishes, while I'm going about my day. Right. And this is something, my parents were always like, oh, she's wasting time doing this. This is something that's, not being very productive, or I don't know why she's doing this. And so, kind of working with my ERP therapist, she was like, I think you might be doing this to get away from your intrusive thoughts, right? You're trying to get away from your distress. So let's do some exposures where we take away your phone, right? Or we kind of block this off from you, right? And I did that for months, and it was so hard, and I couldn't figure out why. I was like, am I just am I just so attached to my phone that I can't function without it? I could not figure it out. And now that I've been diagnosed with ADHD, I recognize actually it's because it actually helps me get things done to have that extra source of dopamine throughout my day, right? And it's not really causing a detriment to my life anymore, because I've no longer assigned it a moral value. It's no longer that I'm wasting time because I'm immoral or anything like that. It's more, listening to music while I do the dishes helps me to have enough dopamine in my brain to do the dishes, right? And it's better that I'm listening to a song while I do them if it means I'm getting them done, right? But it came back to that intention. And I, no hate to my ERP therapist. She just genuinely didn't know what the intention was, or that I had co-occurring ADHD, right? But the intention was definitely not having enough dopamine in my brain, right? Not having enough, having a lot of executive dysfunction. And so that's an area that it can get really gray. And so one thing we tend to ask people when they come to our group and are like, I don't know if this function is something from my OCD or my ADHD, we kind of ask a couple questions about things like, is there any sense of urgency with this? Is this something you can replace with something else? So that's a really good for like stimming behaviors, for instance. Those can be very repetitive, right? If someone's like squeezing a stress ball or pacing back and forth, it might look like they're doing a compulsion. But can they substitute that stim behavior with something else? Instead of pacing around, can they do jumping jacks?
Yep.
Then it's probably not a compulsion, right? It's probably them serving
Easily
some sort of
replaceable.
right. So that's one thing we ask. And then again, the urgency, if it's something that feels like it's neutralizing their distress, getting rid of their distress rather than encouraging them to sit with it, because actually things like stimming can help someone to sit with their distress. They can use
Mhm.
that while they're doing ERP to actively lean into the distress, right? So we always ask some of those questions, but it's definitely I think again, one of the most common things that's brought up in group. I guess another really quick example is I always would have my room would end up getting really messy no matter what I did. And I couldn't figure it out until eventually I realized it started with when I first put my shoes on the ground. That was the first thing that would always go on the floor. And then after that, the all or nothing would kick in and it
Right.
would just spiral into a mess, right? And so for a very long time, I would do a lot of exposure sitting with the distress of this room. And that helped a ton. That helped me to be able to get out of the all or nothing thinking. I also would do little 5-minute cleans. So I guess this is an example of a time when it's both ADHD and OCD. I would do a 5-minute clean and then force myself to stop. And I would sit with
Mhm.
the distress of this isn't all, it's not
Not
nothing,
finishing.
it's in the middle.
Right.
And I would sit with some of the feelings that would happen while I did that. And I practiced that for almost like a solid year before it's got to the place where I'm really comfortable with a 5-minute clean.
Yeah.
And my space feels so much better because I'm able to do a 5-minute clean, right?
Yeah.
But I did a lot of exposures sitting with the middle. And then in terms of the ADHD side of that, I realized, okay, the shoes are the first thing that's starting this mess. What if instead of forcing myself to put them on a shoe rack, which apparently isn't working as much as it's a cute, fun idea, what if I just leaned into it and I just put a bucket right by my door that I could throw my shoes in because I'm already throwing them off. So why don't I do that? And as soon
Right.
as I started throwing them into the
Good
bucket,
idea.
suddenly my room stayed clean, right?
Yep.
So that's kind of an example. That's a lot of what we talk about in our group is kind of like troubleshooting those areas where someone's like, my room is messy and I can't figure out why. And oftentimes we find a little bit of both. Okay, maybe there's some things we can do to work with your brain, work with the fact that you're throwing your shoes off. And also let's combat some of the all or nothing thinking that's leading to the room being messy to begin with, right? So anyway, that's again, one of those places where it can be a little bit difficult to parse out whether
Yeah.
it's ADHD or OCD. But being
Well,
able to identify the intention matters a whole lot.
I can see where too we might get, call it sidetracked or not, by having a discussion about, well, I can understand why you're so worried about this because everyone corrected you when you were wrong and you were always getting
Right.
things wrong. So now you want to get things right and it's manifested in how you keep your room. So we got to do some trauma treatment about all that stuff. I mean, maybe not, but what you're kind of saying is with an ERP lens, we don't get into all that stuff, do we? We actually just change how we're coping with the distressing thought, correct?
Yeah, well, and I think the difference between a lot of these processes is when it comes to OCD, it's very cyclical. You're
Yeah.
asking the same questions. That's something I heard Jenna say earlier. You're asking the same questions. You're figuring out the same problems. You're doing the same compulsions and getting a little bit of distress relief, and then it comes back, right? Whereas with some of these other things, it's not so much this repetitive way of thinking. When you're doing actual trauma work, you're
Mhm.
not repeating the same exact thing every time, right?
Mhm.
You're kind of thinking linearly and you're working through problems and you're able to do that. And
Mhm.
so when someone has trauma and OCD, right, or even OCD that's grabbed onto trauma, we
Mhm.
definitely work on both. Sometimes we'll focus in on just one. So for instance, I worked first on my OCD before my PTSD because I
Mhm.
wasn't in a space where I could emotionally like process anything
Right.
that I needed to do for the trauma work. I was not showering, right? So it
Yeah.
was more important that I did the OCD work first. And sometimes people do the opposite. Sometimes we'll combine both. But definitely there's also an overlap there. And we see in our ADHD group a lot of people who have OCD, PTSD, and and ADHD. And I think one of the most key examples of this overlap is RSD, or rejection sensitivity dysphoria. That's something that's talked a lot about in our ADHD group, right? It's that idea of feeling hypersensitive to any perceived rejection, right? And there's a lot of argument about, is this coming from OCD? Because it could be. It could be coming from this place of not feeling tolerant of your distress when you're rejected, right? And so doing compulsions to avoid that. It could also come from ADHD. And the funny thing is, there's also arguments about why it comes from the ADHD. Does it come from that because you were rejected a lot as a kid because of your neurotype? Does it come from that because there's something inherently perfectionistic about ADHD, right? Like that's, I think, one of those kind of symptoms that has a lot of different potential causes. And so when someone comes to group saying, I'm really sensitive to rejection, right, there's a little bit of unwinding they have to do to figure out where that's coming from and is ERP appropriate. And most of the time it's appropriate to do ERP and work out the root cause.
For sure. When it comes to ADHD, the emotional regulation piece is like neurologically a function of the impulse control. The inattentive symptom, maybe we're not paying attention to either the situation we're walking into, or the red flags we're ignoring, or cues in our own self, that inattentive piece. But the impulse control piece is a big part of what like mediates the emotional response, which the outcome of that could be described, I think, as the rejection sensitivity a piece, because it hurts. And then the vortex of hyperfocusing into, when you get into a fight with someone you love, or there's a perceived, we're not really super great at evaluating both ourselves and other social cues, that it means more than it is. All of a sudden the fight's the only thing that matters, right? The whole perspective
Oh,
is
interesting.
lost.
I love that perspective.
And then I think, so then that's like, yeah, if I slow that whole process down, so then we're left with all these awful feelings, and it feels like that's the only thing we can feel in that moment. I can see where like if you've got OCD, then we've got to do some sort of compensatory behavior to make those awful feelings go away.
Right.
And then if you don't have OCD, then you just flat out paralyze, overwhelm onto the couch, maybe for a couple of days with those awful feelings, until you come out of it, as it goes with ADHD, and then you feel better. Like, to me, I can easily see the two different like things going that way.
Totally. No, yeah, that's spot on. And we do a lot of exposures where people are, we have like a list of ways to mess up, ways to kind of experience rejection. So it might be something like walking into a coffee shop and purposefully tripping, or purposefully saying your order wrong, right? And there's some ways that people can do exposures toward that feeling of rejection. But I think, I mean, the way you just said it was so incredible. I love that, that take on it.
I feel like I did like inadvertent exposure therapy to myself as like a teenager. And I distinctly remember having this like period of time in my life where I could take count of all these awful feelings: humiliation, shame, feeling embarrassed. I wiped out once in front of everybody, like on a slippery floor, even in like first year university. It was mortifying, where I was just like, I'm done with feeling like this. This is not working for me. And I remember, I think it coincided, like I caught some outside influence of someone that says like, whatever you fear, like that should become your to-do list. And I was like, that's cool. I want to do that. It's probably my ADHD brain that even thought that was a good idea. But I literally kind of from that moment on, as a younger woman, was like, if I'm afraid of it, it's coming up next, because I refuse to live my life in fear of anything. Forget it. Right. And so
and that's what ERP is all about.
Yeah,
I think people come into treatment thinking like, okay, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to fix my contamination issues. I'm going to go in there and figure out what sexual orientation I am. And it's like, no, these are skills that I wish I learned when I was little, like how to actually embrace discomfort and how to seek out opportunities to get better when fear is in my way. That's actually why I fell in love with it. So I, like you, Christina, I knew from a really early age, like elementary school level, I remember going to new schools and feeling like, oh my gosh, who am I going to sit next to in the lunchroom? What if they call on me and I don't know what to say? And I was like, I hate feeling that way. I'm not I hate feeling inferior. I hate feeling like that anxiety is, if I'm in some kind of competition with anxiety, I hate losing.
Yep.
So I knew from a very early age, like, okay, well then I guess I have to sit next to the scariest group of people for lunch. I guess instead of just waiting for the teacher to call on me, I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
So ERP is not about, it's not about the subtypes. It's not even about OCD and anxiety. In my opinion, it's about
Facing your
like being
fears.
able,
Like,
facing your fears, and it's getting to
Mhm.
the
being okay
point
with
where like
being
you drive
uncomfortable.
the ship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I kind of wondered sometimes, like, how did I escape perfectionism when I see it so much with people and people I identify with? And, I'm just like, wow. And I think from a nervous system perspective, so that fight flight energy, I have leaned into my fight energy. Like that's my go-to. So I was a bit scrappy when I was younger and can still be at times. And that gets you into trouble. So from an emotional regulation, ADHD woman perspective, certainly can tie my shoelaces together. But it's also protective because it's also mobilized me. So anytime I have been afraid, I'm much more likely to be mobilized to do something proactive, pro-social than to shut down. And so that's the double-edged sword of ADHD life is everything can be
Mhm.
protective and a strength and can also be the thing that makes you really not functional and tie your shoelaces together. And then I can
Totally.
see how if OCD creeps in, that you latch onto something that in that moment worked really, really well, how it can be really hard to give up on that sense of something that gives you that sense of security or certainty, right?
Yeah, no, and that's spot on. I think one thing I hear a lot in that support group we have is that their OCD has served as a means of motivating them
Yeah.
because they haven't had another one, right? With ADHD, motivation's hard. It's hard
Yeah.
not to want to turn to something that can motivate you, right? Again, OCD has been shown to have higher levels of impulse control. And so if you have something like fear and shame that can motivate you to get something done, it's
Mhm.
really hard not to turn to that. And that's
Yeah.
something that a lot of people have to unlearn when they're going through the like ERP process is I remember feeling just petrified. I will not do anything if I'm not using fear and shame. Fear and shame is what gets me out of bed in the morning. It's what gets me into the shower. It's what's getting me to do anything. And there was this huge fight within me of like, I don't want to lose that, right? I feel like if I do the ERP, that's going to go out the window. Um, and so one thing we talk a lot about in that group is how do we motivate with values? How do we, if we're not motivating with fear or shame, now what, right? And I definitely had a period after going through ERP where I didn't know. I didn't know how to motivate at all without those two.
Yeah.
And so that's something we talk a lot about is what are some ways that we can employ little value based motivation throughout our day. What are some ways that we can, use momentum? What are some ways we can use discipline in a way that's not fear or shame,
Yeah.
and still be productive and still get our goals accomplished, right? But I think that's something that I've noticed stopping a lot of people in the ERP process is this has been working, and I say working really loosely because it hasn't been working because they're here, right? But
Yeah.
this has been working in terms of I did get decent grades in school, and it was because my OCD forced me to stay up for 12 hours studying a night, right? I can go into a hyper focus on my compulsions really easily and get a lot done,
Yeah.
right? And so there's kind of this battle internally of am I going to be able to find an internal sense of motivation
Yeah.
after this? And I think that that's why I love that group so much is because they're people who are taking that risk to an even greater extent than I think some people who just have the OCD because they're like, I don't know if I'm going to still have productivity after going through this. And they do, right? Again, they are able to find those skills and they all, for me at least, it's been far better to be able to motivate with values than it was to ever do fear or shame. And it's far more effective, right? But a lot of times they do feel like they're taking a risk of these are not only, I mean, like you said, they're protective, right? These
Mhm.
OCD behaviors have protected me from a lot of my ADHD executive dysfunction.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting thing to watch play out.
Yeah. And I think like opportunity cost too, like I like to help people identify what are they losing out on by choosing this particular coping strategy. Like I took first year
Right.
economics, totally random because of ADHD, right? Like why would I take economics in university? But I did. And the one thing I take away is opportunity cost. Like if I spend my money on this car, what are all the things that I'm not buying with that same amount of money or investing,
Yeah.
right? And so it's like, yeah, this is working for you in this situation. Yeah, but what are you losing by not trying other strategies. And sometimes before you even know what your values are, like if you're not sure and doing that work to figure that out, that could be like a nice discrepancy building kind of strategy to figure that out for anyone listening. I could talk to
Totally.
you guys for like another 3 hours about this. Like this is so interesting. But I'm conscious.
And we're clearly very nerdy about it. Like we get super excited about it. We're invested, and yeah, so we could talk about it.
So many nuances. Like nuances are really important to talk through, right? And it's hard in these sound bites on social media. You know, I think hands down overall social media has been so great because it's just raised so much awareness. It's got people asking questions. It's got people reading and researching and thinking about things more than maybe ever before, and access to right information when you can find like good professionals online too, right? Because it's an accessibility thing too, pretty much everywhere in the world when it comes to mental health. So, you know, where can you tell us where people can find you and where they can find more information if they want to? I'll link all your stuff in the show notes, so everyone, there'll be a reference there.
Awesome. Yeah. So if what we're saying resonates, we have so many free resources on our app. It's just the Treat My OCD app, available on Android, iPhone. So on there, like you'll see Tia, like Tia is on tons of webinars where we go on and we talk about it. We do live question and answers. We definitely know that some people might be listening to this and it might have kicked up some dust. Like, oh my gosh, like I struggle with that. I never realized that could be this. And so we want to make sure that we give people those resources to go and learn more, because you know, we want them to just know where to go. We know that this can be a rough road for people. So we have tons of webinars, access to lots of free tools on our app. So, and there's no gimmick. It's not like $7.99 for the first week and then we take it from you. That's not what it's about. There's no cost, unless you want to do therapy, which some people do, some people don't. We also offer that. But yeah, the Treat My OCD app is just such a huge, rich source of information and education about this. We have some of the most world-renowned professionals in this community for an OCD, so it's just really wonderful. We are over on Instagram at Treat My OCD. You can find me personally. I'm over at jenna.overbot on Instagram. And then I'll let Tia kind of describe anything else that I might have missed about NoCD, and then also where to find Tia.
Can you just tell us real quick what NoCD means?
Very good question. So NoCD actually stands for no compulsion disorder. And so if we could have had another episode, we would talk all about the treatment and why it's so important to not do these compulsions and what happens that's detrimental when you do compulsions. You just reinforce the intrusive thought for next time. You lose confidence in yourself, you know, so on and so forth. So the whole treatment is about not doing those compulsions. And we believe really strongly in that. That's what ERP is all about. So NoCD is this notion of the no compulsion disorder. So we are emphasizing and encouraging people to not do their compulsions.
Got it. Thank you. Tia.
Love that. Yeah, so I do a lot of my advocacy work on, again, ADHD, OCD, and PTSD, kind of that all those things co-occurring on Instagram at Tortilla Wilson. And then I also have a blog where I post a lot of things like, what are mental compulsions? You know, what is ERP? How do we do ERP with kids? All that sort of stuff. And that's tiawilson.org.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've been referencing and dropping these support groups. So as NoCD therapy members, you do get access to our support groups, which Tia runs, specifically this overlapping group, which could be really helpful for everyone who's listening. So it's the overlap of OCD and ADHD. As of right now, they meet every week, and really supportive environment just to know that you're not alone and to hopefully get some more resources.
Totally.
Is it open to residents from the US and Canada? Do borders matter?
Yeah, so it's really just people who are attending therapy with us. So if you've had, you know, at least one session, but we do treat in and out of the US, the best thing to do would be to go to treatmyocd.com. Is it .com? I always forget .com or .org. .com.
treatmyocd.com.
And you can go and set up a free call with our care team, and they can just kind of let you know, like, do we cover your insurance? Do we have someone in your area? Are we able to treat you? And then they can get you started, and they do free little 15-minute kind of intro calls. So that's a good place to turn to.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Much.
That was really, really informative. I think there's going to be lots of questions and maybe requests for a follow-up at some point.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean,
Uh,
it's what you're right. Like, it's so nuanced, and like Tia can relate. I'm sure you can relate, Christina. Like, every time I post something on social, there's like someone who's like, well, what about this? And what about this? And it's like, I can't fit that all into a 1080 by 1080 pixel. Like,
Right.
I can't fit it all into an hour-long podcast episode, but damn it, we tried. So,
Yeah, right.
right. I mean, the whole point is to get everyone thinking, knowing that there's options, you're not alone, and there are
Mhm.
people who want to help and who love talking about this stuff, and hopefully providing the resources starts a path towards a lot of empowerment and action.
Totally.
So that's the bottom line.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Like, every little bit, like, we feel really personally and professionally, obviously, like, we need to chip away at this misconception of what OCD is.
Mhm.
It's just so much more than that. And I think just more generally, like you said, like, people are given this idea that like, you have to go and do this coping skill. You have to go and do this. Distress is bad. But like, if something is fear, if you're afraid of something, like, that needs to be next on your to-do list. Like, we need to encourage people to adopt that mindset more. That's what I feel really strongly about.
100%.
Sounds like you're both kind of firmly saying you can actually really recover from OCD and not have it anymore.
100%. You can,
Yeah.
I feel
Love
really
that.
strongly that, like, and I think Tia has even been open about this before, like, you can no longer meet diagnostic criteria for it, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I no longer am if I walked into a therapist's office, I would not be diagnosed with OCD today. And that is just 180 from me when I wasn't leaving my apartment, wasn't showering, wasn't eating, So definitely, like, recovery is possible. And I think that it's so cool to be able to be a part of OCD, where we have, again, world-renowned therapists and people who understand OCD and the way it works, and are able to really help people to go through that ERP process in a way that's understanding of co-occurring things like ADHD, and kind of treating the whole person and not just, one diagnosis.
I love that. Thanks, guys.
yeah,
Thank
thank you so much.
you.
And this was a great partnered. I was worried, like, oh my gosh, am I going to talk over Tia? But we nailed it. I feel like everyone did a great job.
Yeah.
You guys are great.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Christina. And let us know whenever it's about to go live or whenever it goes live. We'll make sure we post it to our social, both of our individual socials, and then we'll push it out to our newsletter too. It goes out to like 250,000 subscribers. So we'll make sure everyone knows about it. Just send me the link. And if you could send me like any pictures that you want or whatever, we'll make sure that we get it out.
It's actually gonna be quick. It might actually be Monday.
Sure.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, it just depends on if my producer can do it this weekend. But I think she can. So because I can't do it. But I'll let you know for sure. It'll be quick though.
Cool. Sounds good.
Awesome.
Yeah, then we'll
Thank you so much.
Awesome,
yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, that was so fun.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.
You too.
Bye.